Hey everyone, good afternoon from a cozy winter afternoon in Bellevue, Washington. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first fireside chat of 2024. I'm super excited to be hosting this. My name is Sid, and I'm from the product marketing team at Statsig. And our guest today is joining us from, I guess, a sunnier city in Southern California. And I couldn't be more excited to be kicking this year's Fireside Chat series with Dylan Lewis, who's an experimentation leader at Atlassian and truly a veteran in this domain for more than 2 decades. Before we get started, I'll have Dylan definitely introduce himself in just a moment. And as people trickle in, I just want to get a couple of quick housekeeping items out of the way. The first is that we are recording this session, so we'll share this to you in a couple of days via email in case you want to evangelize this internally in your companies. And the second is that we had tons of questions come in during the registration. So what Dylan and I did was we went over these questions and tried to collate them and develop questions that kind of address the different themes that came up. A lot of things around experimentation culture, what Dylan has learned in his career, how things work at Atlassian, and so on. So what we'll do is we'll go over those questions for the first 30 to 40 minutes of this webinar. And at the end of that, I will give everyone the chance to ask questions on either the live chat or Q&A. Like, you can keep them coming in throughout the session, and I'll keep tabs on that. And we'll leave maybe 15 minutes at the end to take some questions live as well, in case you didn't submit your questions when registering. So you should have the ability to ask these questions on the webinar chat, or you can use the Q&A option on Zoom as well. Without further ado, let me have Dylan do a quick introduction, and then we'll move on to the questions for this fireside chat.
Thanks, Sid. Hey, everyone. My name is Dylan Lewis. I currently work at Atlassian as the head of experimentation within the data science organization. Prior to that, I was at Intuit for 15 years. I did 12 years in TurboTax, a year as an analytics evangelist. In my last 2 years there, I was a product manager for the Intuit experimentation platform. My background is I started off in industrial organizational psychology and educational technology, heavy stats in that area. Did a stint at an internet company that sold software only through the internet in the early 2000s. Worked at an analytics vendor for a year and then went to Intuit. So happy to be here today and happy to chat about what I've learned about experimentation along the way.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, for joining us today. It's really amazing to kick off this year's Fireside Chats with you. And I have to ask you this even before we get started, because one of the many stickers on my laptop says no hippo, a term that you coined nearly 2 decades ago, I think, and which has now become commonplace in our experimentation vocab. Can you share the story and reasoning behind the hippo? I'm sure this is something a lot of our audience will really appreciate knowing.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I joined Intuit in 2005 at TurboTax.com as the first digital analyst, there to help make the data more accurate, but then also helping to shepherd the experimentation program along. It wasn't just me. There was a team of about 15 of us called the web team. And tax is a really interesting thing, right? So it is a very short window. You start, the e-file opens in January and then it ends on April 15th, and that's it, right? So you basically have a quarter to learn as much as you possibly can and sell what you can and help customers in the best way that you can. So at the end of that, we have this thing where we go back and we compile our learnings, right? And so we look back and we saw what happened during that period of time, and we had a really interesting, I guess, laboratory is the way to think about it, where we learned a lot of different ways in order to be able to experiment, which is awesome. But we had a really strong leader who had joined, who wasn't that familiar with digital, and we had another really strong leader within Intuit that was helping this person. And they came in and would come in on every Monday and come up with a whole bunch of ideas of things that we're going to go and do. We would go and build out those experiments, and we would launch them on Friday, and then come back and see the ones that were launched the week before on the next. So we're basically doing a week-long agile sprints, which was amazing. When we look back at the end of the tax year and we saw that we ran 40 experiments, and 38 of them didn't win. 2 of them did win. Those 2 actually came from marketers, people that understood the customers, were talking with customers and were being with them. And so these other 38 of them came from the leaders that really had ideas about what they wanted to go do, and they just didn't pan out, right? And so we said, look, so that's one of our learnings in the slide is, the highest paid opinion may not be right, right? And so the customer is the one who actually, or the user, or the people who are experiencing the treatments are the ones who actually are helping us to understand what's going to win. That was on the slide. Avinash was working at Intuit at the time. Avinash Kaushik, he shared it with Ronnie Kohavi. And if you go to experiment platform, exp-platform.com/hippo, you can see the slide and learn about what happened to it after there. But Avinash spoke about it at an eMetrics conference. Ronnie published about it. And the hippo is basically everywhere, which is awesome. Awesome to see. I even have it on my journal that I keep track of as well. So
That's awesome.
yeah, so pretty cool stuff. I'm glad it came about. It wasn't meant to denigrate anybody, but it was meant to say, hey, look, let's let the data decide. Let's figure it out and then have that tell us what the right answer is.
That's awesome. No, I love it, and I'm so glad we're documenting the story behind this. I also want to know, in terms of shaping a data-driven culture, what role do such symbols play? Like why, HIPPO is obviously this really cool term that has just stuck, and many of us have heard of it, use it in our jobs. But are there any other symbols you've come with, that you've come across with or come up with, and why are these symbols important?
Yeah, well, let me talk a little bit more about the hippo. So the next tax season, and by the way, just so really clear, like having C-level support of the experimentation program is super helpful, right? They're the ones that help make it so that things get prioritized. This is a focus area. This is the way that the organization learns and the way that the organization is successful. And so the next season, the teams or the leaders decided that we were going to have 3 separate teams, right? And so we were going to have a team in San Diego, a team in San Francisco, and a team with an agency out in Kansas City. And so because the hippo had already started catching on, what we did was as each team was experimenting, if they had a winning experiment for that particular week, we shipped off a hippo to them. And so everybody went from one place to the other, depending upon which team was winning for that particular week, and they got to decorate it. There's only like a little tiny button here that's left, but it had all sorts of decorations on it by the end of the tax season. So, these symbols bring up a lot of fun and a lot of excitement about things. And we had other ones too, which were skunks. So we gave people skunks if their experiments didn't win, and we had primary keys for every experiment. So we'd write down the primary key for the experiment on the skunk, and then hand them out to all the teams if their experiments didn't make it to 100%. Really funny, it's good. But by the end of the season, you'd have engineers that had worked on 15 experiments, and so they had created these entire dioramas on their desks with like skunks killing each other's skunk. It was really funny. But it was one of those things to make it a little more lighthearted, a little more fun, which I think is good. Yeah, so I'm glad that we have the hippo and the stinky as well. Really, really helpful in making it so it's a bit more fun to do the experimentation programs.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. And it's awesome that it's part of the culture. I can only imagine in someone's performance review, them saying, hey, I have 12 stinkies. So, I deserve a raise. But no, that's awesome. Like, I love that you kept these artifacts. So I want to ask you next, what does it really mean though to have that culture? Like, what does good experimentation culture look like on a day-to-day? And what does it mean to develop and scale, a mature experimentation program? And feel free to share any anecdotes you have, because I think the audience is really enjoying some of these stories from your experience.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is that Intuit, there's a design for delight mentality and customer-driven innovation, where basically what it comes down to is figure out what the biggest goal is, figure out what has to be true in order for us to be able to accomplish that goal. And then also, what are the things that you can test in order to be able to understand if those things are true or not? And so that's an experimentation mindset, which is great. And that is part and parcel of what that culture was all about. And one of the things that really drove me to be a part of Intuit. And so I think that when you look at an experiment culture, it's a culture that's willing to take risks and willing to have place different bets in different areas. And a lot of the things that the skunks was a bet. It was a hypothesis that, hey, if we make this more fun when people lose, as opposed to just the hippo when people win, that they'll enjoy it, and they'll have memories as well about the experimentation programs that they were a part of. And so it's these different ways of putting things into practice and seeing if they win or lose, and measuring their impact, and then seeing how they change the culture is really, when you see a true culture of experimentation, I think. We put these things into practice, and sometimes they don't work, right? So we had a team that was really, really focused on when they would launch an experiment, they would do betting in their own team, right? $5 a person put in, and then figure out which treatment would actually work. And it worked really, really well on that team. And so we devised a way to make it so that people could bet on any experiment that launched at any point in time. And it kind of died out because some people kept betting on control again and again and again. And which is like, it's really weird because you're betting on the control to win. And then if you think about it, they spent a whole bunch of time making it so that control was amazing. And so they didn't believe any of the treatments were there. So we had to get rid of the betting system because it wasn't getting any traction, right? And so it's those things that you just put out there to see if you can make things better and get a better outcome. And that happens not just with betting, but with all the things that we do across the organization.
No, that's awesome. I mean, I can see how the gamification and that element of fun can incentivize teams to, make experimentation a part and parcel of their day to day. So I think that's awesome. Going into some of the more, tactical aspects of experimentation, in both Intuit and Atlassian, you've overseen tons of experiments. So I'm curious to know, what is your review process look like? And how does that get built into the culture, right? How do you go beyond just the stinkies and the hippos, but also, operationalize that culture on a day-to-day?
Yeah, so experiment reviews are really important, right? At Intuit, we would, as I said before, we would get around the table on Monday of every week and talk about what experiments we were going to launch and what was happening with the experiments that I just completed. And that level of review, I didn't realize at the time, it was super helpful for helping get the entire team on the same page, as well as helping us get to the right practices for our particular team, as well as be able to start using the tools correctly, right? And being able to funnel insights to others and get input from others to understand what's actually going on. And it starts simply with the hypothesis, right? So reading out the hypothesis, we're going to do this. This is going to happen because we believe this, and this is the metric we think that it's going to move. Just a simple hypothesis framework, level setting, making it so that people understand what it is that you're going to be trying to affect. Then walking through what the experience is. If it's before an experiment, walking through potentially the Figma or the Photoshop files. And if it's after an experiment, walking through what the actual screen captures were that the users experienced. And then talking about what the results were or what questions needed to be handled or having a discussion. So that review process is really super helpful for getting everything out onto the table, understanding any assumptions. But not only that, it also allows for people who aren't part of the experimentation process to have their input. And for example, somebody might be struggling with getting a particular trait for a user, and they may have already solved it in some other place, and so then they can input that information into that engineer's process. So really, really good. It's also neat to watch when you have a result and nobody can figure out why something is happening a particular way, and then somebody will say, well, wait, you missed this little piece, and then they put it together, and so you can have a better understanding about the result of the experiment. So really, really good to have those discussions both before and after an experiment has launched or completed.
Yeah, and I guess it's about bringing the entire team into the process, and cross-functional collaboration is obviously key. What are the roles that matter though? Like, when it comes to the experimentation process, like who all is involved in a successful experimentation culture?
Yeah, it differs from company to company, from what I've seen and talked to with other people. Some places is very engineering driven, right? Where they're the ones that are coming up with the ideas, potentially working with the data scientist or not. Where I've seen it be really successful is having a strong product management leader who understands the customer, great DS support, data science support, or analytics support, understands the data behind what's going on and what's possible. Awesome engineering, and amazing design too, right? All working together, and hopefully having program management support as well, to make sure that we can move the ship along. So it's a team sport, and if any one of those things is lacking, I found that there's issues that will come up, and you have to figure out how to block and tackle those. But those are the key critical roles that I think are required to have great experiment outcomes.
And did you see any differences from between your time at Intuit and Atlassian in terms of how the experimentation org was, I'm sure they're both successful and huge scale, and maybe you can talk about that as well. But did you see any key differences as well?
The teams, even across Intuit and across Atlassian, each team is a little bit different, right? So they have stronger players in certain roles, and they have potentially people that are missing in those roles. And you have to have you have to have the mindset of each one of those different areas in order to be able to help make this happen. Atlassian is a very engineering-driven culture, and Intuit was more product management when I was there, and more marketing, but is now becoming a super engineering house as well. So different approaches, but great results nonetheless.
Nice. One of the questions that a lot of people actually asked during registration had to do with, prioritization and, measuring success of the experimentation program. Can you touch upon that in terms of what your prioritization framework looks like? And again, maybe how does that become part of the culture?
Yeah, so I've tried a lot of different prioritization frameworks, and the ones that you can apply. All right, so how much learning are we going to get? How much customer love we're going to get? Or you can use the RICE model, or you can use this model or this model, and they all have their benefits, but they all have a lot of drawbacks as well. There's no secret. It's just what works best in your particular area. The one thing that I know that does work really, really well, and this isn't just a framework, it's just how we go after and accomplish problems. It goes back to the design for delight and customer-driven innovation. Like I said before, what's the business objective? What's the desired behavior? What assumptions have to be true in order for that to happen? What are things that we can do to help make sure that those assumptions are correct? And what are the things that we can do to help make it so the customer can be more successful? That's part and parcel of, that's part of how we should be prioritizing everything. And we can come up with the RICE framework and all of those things, but at the end of the day, those frameworks are there just to make it so that we allocate resources more efficiently. And if we're going after the business objectives and the customer objectives, then we should be doing the same thing as well.
Right. We keep stressing on culture, but how do you measure this culture in terms of KPIs or OKRs on a dashboard? You spoke a lot about prioritization, about the experimentation review process, and we keep emphasizing on day-to-day practices and culture. But you as an experimentation leader, how do you measure that this culture is actually working, and what do you track and goal toward?
Yeah, I'm looking at my list of things that I include in our scorecard, but I want to say that there's a couple things that we want to make sure we get right. Number one is we want to minimize the number of restarts, right? And so how do we make it so that people can launch an experiment and have it work as planned, and have it be representing what it is that we want to have happen. An interesting story about that is we had a really strong team of experimenters, and went in and spoke with the leader there, and she had a scoreboard up of her experiments and pointed out that 40% of them launched with errors, right? And so that's a problem. Like if 4 out of 10 experiments are launching and there's an error, that's a huge problem. And so we implemented one quick change to make it so that went down to less than 5%, and that was a launch party. So when an experiment would launch, we would just let it open just to us, just the people that were in the room. We would get everybody in the room. We would go through the experience. We would make sure that the experience works as expected. We would always have somebody who wasn't part of the team that built the experiment, so they could go through it without having that knowledge of like, this is how it should work, which is really helpful. And we reduced the number of restarts significantly, went down to 5%. And so that's one thing that we look at is how many broken experiments do we launch, or broken experiences do we launch. Then we rang a gong so that everybody could hear it across the halls, and celebrated the launch of the experiment once we verified it ourselves. So super helpful.
That's awesome. No, I love how all of these are part of the day to day, and it has like that sort of fun and cultural piece to it. And that's awesome in driving these outcomes that you desire. But you touched upon something interesting on experimentation errors, which made me think about just trust in the entire process, because there's obviously going to be some stakeholders in the organization who may not be fully bought into experimentation. And I was wondering, how do you create trust in the entire process? How do you ensure that especially results and the analysis is also trustworthy, and more people are being bought in to experimentation and are leveraging it in terms of their day-to-day decision making?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and that is uh, something that I think that we go through as we talk to each new team, whether it was at my former company or my current company, or when I talk to other people as well that are doing this in their companies. Starting off with an AA test, right? So just two treatments, no difference. Is the system working correctly? Do we have the right allocation? To launching our first test, looking at the results, and then seeing if we hold the statistical rigor as high as we possibly can. And if it wins, that's great. Can we then keep the experiment going? Can we then repeat the results of that experiment with another experiment and say, look, the wins are true. We have this experiment it ran and this experiment that it ran, is a great way. And that's one thing that we've done. We also did something where you leverage holdouts after we roll out the experiment and said, look, we have this result. We want to see if it actually works. And so we're going to have a holdout going forward that doesn't have that treatment, and roll it out for the rest of 100% and see if we have that result. So different things you can do depending upon what capabilities you have within your organization in order to be able to help increase that level of trust. The other thing is, hey, we think that we're affecting this particular result. Do we see that needle move in the business or not? Right. And so when we make that 100%, are those results flowing through to the business the way that we think that they are, or flowing through to the customer so that they're, potentially contacting support less because we've made the feature better?
Nice. Yeah, no, I mean, I think we like having that trust is going to be so important, especially if you want to scale it across the organization. So amidst, the launch parties, the gongs, making sure that the entire process is trustworthy. I'm sure you also care about just the velocity or the speed of iteration. And I think a lot of our, customers at Statsig as well, often want that transformation of, being able to go from, say, running single digit or near zero experiments per quarter to then being able to 10x, 20x that as part of that cultural change.
Yep.
So for companies that are trying to do this, what are the usual roadblocks to achieving that? Because I think most people agree, especially the ones who are tuning into this webinar, want to achieve this, transformation. Can you touch upon what are the usual roadblocks to achieving that desired velocity of iteration and experimentation?
Yeah, I can touch on a couple, and talk about a project that I was on, that really addressed it. I think that's really, really helpful to think about. When we started out, we were running one experiment a week. And when we ended that season, we were running 6, right? And so figuring out how to have multiple experiments on the same plane, basically, is one of those tricks that wasn't known about in 2006, right? And so with the tools that are available to us today in StatSig, for example, you have different layers and you can make it so that you can have 2 experiments running in the same place at the same time, without conflicting with one another. So it's a well-known, well figured out problem at this point. Still tough to do, but still well known and well capable of doing. So you can increase the speed of your experimentation velocity, by figuring out how to run more experiments at the same place. The other thing that you can do is you can figure out how to reduce the amount of time required to run the experiment, right? So can you choose a different metric so that it has lower variance or a higher conversion rate? Can you make it so that it's less noisy? basically, and you actually are identifying and targeting the right population for that particular experiment so that you can reduce that runtime. So anything you can do to reduce the runtime is the other piece as well. But the project that I love most is when we look end to end from idea all the way through to decision, and we try and identify where are areas in that entire process flow that we can optimize. So for example, it might take a month to do the post-analysis. Well, what can we do in order to be able to make it so that the post-analysis doesn't take a month, it takes a day, right? And so there's ways in which you can look at your systems and figure out what it is that's required to make this better, and then you can resource those effectively to make it so that that's limited as possible. We want that cycle, that learning cycle, to be as short as possible, and I think everybody else does as well. And the best way to do that is to take the experts from those particular areas and say, what if you could resource this with 100 people? What would you do, right? And then what if you had a magic wand? What would you do? And we had a particular team where it was taking us, I worked with it took a month. We got them down to 10 days, right? And I've seen teams that take a quarter and getting them down to half a quarter, which is great. So it is possible to reduce that amount of time. You just have to have the focus there. But before you can do that, you have to run a whole bunch of experiments. You have to know where those areas of opportunity are, and you have to make it so you can say, okay, this is the next thing that we're gonna attack in order to be able to reduce that runtime or cycle time as much as possible.
Right. You touched upon, two areas of improvement, one being the processes and the other being the tooling capabilities. You said, concurrent experiments, and in a previous response, you brought up the idea of holdouts for trustworthiness.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, in terms of, the tooling piece, how does a lot of companies try to build some of these capabilities in-house, and sometimes don't get these capabilities, especially for trustworthiness or for concurrent experiments. How would you advise someone who's thinking about that sort of build versus buy for their organization? Do you have any thoughts on how someone should think about that?
I do. First thing is go and check out Ronnie Kohavi's course. He has a whole section on build versus buy, which I think is worthwhile for everybody to check out. But I also believe that, hey, it's hard to build something like this, right? And if you're not an expert in this particular field, if you don't know how hashing algorithms work and how to actually make it so that you can do the calculations on the back end, it's a tough road, right? It's not something that you should be taken lightly. It's not something that an engineer can go spin up in a sprint, and build a trustworthy platform. When I started, these platforms didn't exist. That's not true. There were 2 or 3 that existed. We used Offermatica, which then got bought by Adobe and is now Test and Target, at Intuit. And so the challenges are with building your own is you have to maintain it, you have to adjust it, you have to continuously apply resources to it, versus buying something off the shelf and then you still have to maintain it. You have to maintain it in-house. You still have to help make it work within your system. So there's still a bunch of development work that has to happen there in order for it to be correct. So if you don't have to build it, that would be great. If you're a build culture, then build it as much as you can, but realize that you're going to have to resource it too, and it's going to have to continuously get better. You can't build it and forget it. You have to continuously feed it with resources and capabilities. We looked across, when I was at Intuit, we looked across the set of applications, and we saw 7 different testing platforms, each built by a different engineering team at one point or another. And that's not a good thing, right? Because then you've got different allocation strategies. You have to figure out how to make it so one experience flows into another experience. That's just a mess. And so at that point, looked up, and they ended up buying a company that came in and helped build Wasabi, which was an open source testing platform. It's still out there, the code's still out there, but again, that doesn't meet the requirements of a modern day experimentation stack. So there's a lot to know there for sure.
Yeah, no, interesting sort of trip down the memory lane to some of the legacy tooling that was available, 10, 20 years ago compared to maybe some of the modern day capabilities. But I'm curious to know, you've witnessed a lot of technological and platform shifts firsthand in this period from Intuit to now at Atlassian. And obviously that's changed the way products are being built and tested. I'm curious to know what is still challenging today compared to your early days at Intuit, and what has become easier, and really how this domain has evolved, and what you've seen and learned.
Yeah, I think, the initial piece of this conversation is all about experimentation culture, right? And that's the piece that still remains, that's still a challenge. Unless you are born on the internet, a company born on the internet with experimentation in your DNA, it's not something that is instantly there. And so it's one of those change management pieces that we have to do. As far as the capabilities of the modern day platforms, they're more robust. There's more people that have used them and kicked the tires, and the trustworthiness of the metrics are better. The stats behind them are more solid. We have SPR, sequential probability ratio tests. Lots of companies have that capability within their tools today, and more are getting them, which is awesome. So I would say that the analytics components are better. The statistical rigor is higher than what it was before. The capability, because many different teams have integrated with experimentation platforms in the past, onboarding is much easier than what it was previously. And so I think that we've come a long way. There's still challenges, and getting to a culture of experimentation is still a challenge. It's still an area that I think we all have to work through in our own respective roles.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting that, I mean, with even though you have more modern day like tooling and capabilities for even out of the box capabilities that organizations can take advantage of, it's interesting that I guess barring some of the internet first businesses, that culture still remains a very challenging piece. So no, thanks for sharing that. I think it's quite interesting to think about how this space has evolved. I want to let our audience know that you can send in your questions on the live chat. I have a couple of final things to ask Dylan, and then I want to take some of your questions and have Dylan answer them live. So you can use the Q&A option or the chat to just submit your questions for Dylan, and in a few minutes, once I wrap up our conversation, we can have Dylan answer these live. I guess as we come to the last bit of this chat, what advice would you give to someone who's trying to build this culture from the ground up at their organization, who's trying to advocate for a stronger emphasis on experimentation, the need to invest more efficient tools and processes sooner rather than later? Especially, I'm sure it can be challenging if you're like a lone wolf just trying to bring about the change in a company, but you want to get everyone on board. As you touched upon, it's a team sport, so you need that buy-in from your stakeholders. So what advice would you give to an earnest data-driven person in a company to like push this forward?
Yeah, a couple of things. I'll start with you can experiment within your own culture. So what experiments are you going to run on your experimentation program? I think figuring out what you think will have the biggest impact over the next quarter, and trying that out and seeing if it pays out. That's taking that mindset of here, I'm going to move this lever and I want experimentation culture to grow. And when you do that, and what are you actually going to do? Experiment reviews are one great way. Pavel Dmitriev and Alexander Fabian wrote a paper called "It Takes a Flywheel to Fly," and it actually goes into some really specific things to go and do around experimentation to make it so that it can grow within a company. And so I would highly suggest that you look at that article and read through it. It's really good. Find a single team, identify a big win that the team has, help them get that big win, then share that win broadly and start building up that momentum so that people can start understanding the benefit of experimentation within your culture and within your company. And sometimes it doesn't stick, right? So I've seen people try that at other companies and it just doesn't work. And so, there's lots of companies out there that want to experiment and they want to get better and measure the impact. So lots of opportunities are out there. So experiment reviews is one, and having that experiment mindset is the other one.
Yeah, so if a company has just sort of maybe invested in tooling, or just hired a few people to like push this forward in their company, what do you think would be like a realistic objective for, say, the first quarter or for the first couple of quarters? Like what should be top of mind for someone who's just invested in the tooling and is going to start experimenting. They've never run experiments before in their company, and they're just starting. Obviously, the reviews piece, as you said, is going to be crucial. But do you have any advice for such a company? I think we have a lot of such people who are attending today.
Yeah, I think get through your first 10 experiments as quickly as possible, right? So figure out how the machine works, figure out how your organization works, figure out how you can go from idea to decision quickly so that you can get those feedback loops. You're going to make mistakes, embrace those mistakes, savor those surprises, I guess is the right way to think about it, and move on. I think you have a ways to go, but don't get discouraged by it. Use it as a way to learn and consistently get better. And you're going to find some wins, which is going to be awesome. You're going to learn about your customers, which is even more awesome. And potentially you'll have some better appreciation for all those great features that are out there on some of those other sites as well.
Yeah, experimentation as a gateway to learning about customers is like a really nice way to think about it, I guess. And I see we already have a few questions coming in, so I want to get to that in just a moment. But my final question for you, Dylan, before we move to the Q&A is, have you encountered any surprising experiments or lessons that, contradicted common business norms? We actually had one of our registrants ask this question, and I thought that was really interesting, just in terms of, you must have seen so many experiments at Intuit, at Atlassian. You must have seen so much, accepted business norms in the workplace. Did you come across any really interesting ones that contradicted what was considered law in the company? And how did these impact the approach going forward?
Yeah, I would say I'm fortunate enough to be in at companies where pushing the boundaries is actually okay. And so you're finding out where those elephants in the room are, and then try to figure out a way to ride them, I think is a good thing, right? So I would say that there isn't really something I can draw on there quite easily. I think I can talk about experimentation program and hypotheses that I had that I thought were good. We had a hypothesis that not showing any of the experiment data until it was significant was going to be an okay thing to do. And so because it's like, hey, statistically, there's no difference between A or B at this point. So looking at the numbers doesn't really matter. And boy, did that fail. The PMs were enraged, I guess is the way to say it. And I quickly had to back that change out of the scorecards because people really did want to see the numbers, even though there was no difference between the two. And so I think you're going to find interesting things like that as you look at your program to try and figure out what's going to work and what doesn't work. And by the way, there was a company that was doing that. There was an experimentation provider, and so I lifted that and tried to see if that would work out in our company, and it just didn't. So
that's awesome. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I want to get to a few questions that have come in. And to our audience, please keep your questions coming. We'll try to get to as many as we can over the next 10 to 15 minutes. So one question from Dilip, which might be interesting to take, is how do you decide when not to experiment? Is there ever a situation where you don't want to experiment? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, obviously, when you're fixing a critical bug, you don't want to experiment. When you're making things right for customer confusion, you don't want to experiment. But the key here isn't just that you're not really experimenting, but you still are measuring impact, right? You still want to be able to roll those changes out and be able to understand more or less what the impact was. And so, we have 3 different ways of doing this, right? So you could do YOLO, where you just eat it out there and you only learn occasionally. You've got the measured rollouts, right? And so this is where you're doing something to help improve performance or helping to make it so that the customer concern or the security issue is completely blocked. And then the last one is, a hypothesis-driven experiment, right? And so you have to figure out where you're going to be on those 2, depending upon, sample size, meaningfulness to the customer, and importance to the company. And if it's one of those things that you just have to do for those reasons that I meant before, just make sure that you can measure the impact in some way, shape, or form. That's the most important piece. And sometimes it's not possible to run an experiment because the impact would have to be so great. And so you iterate your way through there. You look at the Lean Startup book, and what Reese was talking about there, where he was just rolling out major changes after major changes because it was a very small company because he didn't have a large sample size. That's in the case when he's not experimenting, he's just piloting, right? And trying to figure out his way forward and trying to navigate that, but by measuring the impact of those results. So, feature change that has to be done for security, helping customers through confusion or things like that. And those are the areas where I wouldn't experiment. But I would try and figure out if there's a way to measure and the impact of those changes.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I like the way you laid it out in terms of the different kinds of situations and like what nature of like experimentation or like feature flagging that you would use in those situations. Thank you, Dilip, for asking that question. One more question on the Q&A. It's from an anonymous attendee. Is on if you could share examples on how marketing and product teams collaborate on experimentation. Maybe this could be something you've experienced at Intuit, where you said marketing had a pretty big say in things. So he goes on to ask, marketing tends to optimize for acquisition, product tends to optimize for adoption and retention. It seems like high growth companies have figured out how to get both of these separate functions working together on growth. Would love to hear your thoughts on how they do this.
Yeah, I don't think this is an experimentation function. I think this is a function of the leadership within the company saying that this is a priority. Experimenting is just a way in which we go about and measure and understand the changes that we're driving. And so if this is a large enough initiative and it has the buy-in from both product and marketing, it will happen in that particular company. But it has to have that leadership buy-in and it has to have that direction. Experimentation is really a business function. It's another thing that we do. And so, working together, marketing has a different stack than product, yes. How do we make it so that we can help bring more customers in, have them have the ability to accomplish their tasks and be able to come back again and again and again? I don't think that's a marketing problem or a product problem. It's a business problem. And so that's where I've seen people and teams across many different areas, even with customer care, trying to solve the business problem there. And that happens with, realizing and aligning on the same set of goals that we're here in order to be able to serve our customers and make it so we have a better experience for them.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think one more might be the same person, but one more question is, what do you think about the future of web experimentation? And will everyone eventually go server side? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I am an experimenter. I am not a truth teller. I cannot predict the future. I can only have hypotheses about it. I think that it's going to get really interesting, but I don't know how difficult it's going to be. And I have full confidence in our abilities with smart engineers to figure out how to measure impact through experiments. And so I'm excited to see what happens. I don't have the answer.
That's fair. That's fair. One more question from Carlos. And you kind of touched upon this aspect on like sample size very briefly during our conversation, but this might be more relevant maybe to like smaller companies and startups especially. What do you do when you don't have as much traffic as you'd like? Do you have any thoughts on that? We might have, smaller companies that especially might be curious to know the answer for this.
Yeah. The things we have the same problem, and I've seen this problem in many different places, is how do you bundle things up so that the magnitude of the change is bigger? So do multiple different changes at the same time is one area. Another area here is, maybe don't do a test, maybe just pilot it out there and see if you're getting the change that you want, because there just isn't a way that you can run an A/B test in that particular area. And I think that you have to look at, is it worth it to be experimenting there when you have a small sample size? And maybe that is the only place that you have. So then you have to get really creative about, are you going to be running a highly rigorous statistical test at a 0.01 confidence interval or 99% confidence interval? Probably not. You probably don't have the sample size to be able to detect that. So you might have to relax some of your statistical requirements there. If you have to, but I would do that the last resort for sure. So look for places where you can bundle changes, make them bigger for customers, and realize that not all of them are gonna come to fruition and not be successful, right? So, and there's a blog article, I think, on the StatSig site also talking a little bit about this too.
Yeah, I can drop that on the link uh, right after this. I guess one final question is on uh, any good conferences for data scientists doing experimentation that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's one this week, which is just an analytics conference called Super Week, and it's happening, and I'm not attending. I think it's in I want to say Hungary, but I'm not positive. There's other ones. There's a little bit of experimentation across many of the data science conferences. There's the marketing, the eMetrics Summit, which is now the Mark Jim Stern's conference. And then there's also there's one in Austin as well with CXL that I know about. And then there's a number of different conferences. There's the best way to find out about the different conferences, I think, would be to look up Kevin Anderson's newsletter, and I think it's called Experiment Mind, and he has all the conferences on there that are related to experimentation. Good area to good newsletter to subscribe to.
Yeah, be sure to check out those resources. I've dropped the blog that Dylan referenced on the chat as well. I think we've covered all the pending questions, and we obviously hit almost all the questions that were asked during registration in our conversation. So, as we conclude this fireside chat, Dylan, do you have any, final thoughts, any, parting thoughts for our audience today?
Yeah, as I got ready for this, I looked at all of the things that we've been doing or that I've done over the past history and what different experiments I run in experiment programs, and I realized that there's still more experiments to run if we're on our programs. And so even the ones that I ran in the past, I haven't run recently, and so I don't know if they apply in our particular culture, which I'm really excited to go back and try. So I would say figure out how to run quarter-long experiments in your business on what your business processes. Figure out what it takes in order to be able to move the needle there, and let me know what experiments work for you, because I'm really interested to learn too. I don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, and would love to hear from everyone on what they've done and what's worked and what hasn't worked.
Yeah, that's awesome. Everyone can also, take advantage of the Slack community with StatSig, which is quite active for discussions around experimentation. Feel free to, share interesting observations and learnings from your experiments there, and we're happy to engage. But other than that, thank you so much, Dylan, for joining us today and kicking off our Fireside Chat series. I don't think we could have asked for a better guest to kick things off in 2024. So I really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to join us. I'm also thankful for all the audience who submitted questions during registration and also showed up this afternoon to participate. And I hope this session was engaging and helpful. Please keep the conversation going with us at StatSig on the Slack community. Feel free to connect with Dylan as well. A lot of great anecdotes from today's conversation that I'm really excited to document and maybe share in the form of a blog post sometime next week. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we hope to see you in the next set of fireside chats that we'll do over the course of the year. Thank you so much for joining us, and bye for now.
Thanks all. Bye.